In the late 1940s, the Arab nations had been defeated by the Israelis, bringing about the end of many old leaders. Abdullah in Jordan was assassinated, Camille Chamoun now ruled in Lebanon, and Adib Jiskali had taken full power in Syria. In the early 1950s, though, Egypt would change the region forever. Here, people had become disillusioned with prominent national parties like Wafd, who had continued to work alongside the British and make Egypt generally poorer. For instance, in 1945 it was reported that 80% of the population had waterborne illnesses, or in 1947, 80,000 people died in another cholera epidemic. On top of that, they had also failed in their war against Israel. Yet they still clung on to power in the 1950 election, thanks to the absence of the Muslim Brotherhood in the ballots, and the Wafd party continued down the same path. Then, even when there was a cotton boom, the corrupt government under Nahas left most of the money in the hands of just a few people. King Farouk even caused a great deal of anger by travelling to Europe for a couple months in extreme extravagance. The CIA even got involved with Project FF. The FF, by the way, stood for the Fat Bleeper, referring here to the size of King Farouk. They tried to pressure him to make social reforms and stop the possibility of a violent uprising or a possible swing to communism, but this all failed. So the CIA began to make contact with the Free Officers movement, which included Nasser. He had served in the war in Palestine, becoming a national hero, yet even he recognized the poor standard of his army. After the war, he made contact with the Muslim Brotherhood, but their goals and his secular ideology were incompatible. So he took inspiration from al-Zaim's coup in Syria and focused on recruiting military men into his newly formed Association of Free Officers. However, in 1950, they only had around 90 men, so they couldn't do much. In 1951, the Wafd government agreed to cancel their agreements with the British, possibly hoping to distract the population from their nation's problems. They essentially just told the British to leave the Suez Canal zone, and Farouk even called himself the King of Egypt and Sudan. When the British refused to leave, the Egyptians cut off water to the British camps and guerrilla attacks began. Farouk then tried to make Hussein Syria Emir his new war minister, but Emir was a corrupt leader and largely blamed for their loss against Israel. It was then that Nasser first decided to act, as he tried to assassinate Emir. When this failed, he made a new plan, and he concluded that he needed high-ranking, well-respected leaders to take charge of his young officers. For this, he brought in Mohammed Najib. The situation around the Suez Canal, though, continued to escalate, as in January 1952, the Egyptian police joined the guerrillas in attacking a British base. The British then proceeded to destroy the police barracks and killed around 50 policemen, causing outrage across the country. The people rioted and buildings were destroyed on what has been called Black Saturday. The Shepherd's Hotel, Barclays Bank and many nightclubs were targeted, and many people were killed. Some have speculated that these riots were well planned out, given the speed and equipment used. However, nobody can agree on who was behind them. Maybe it was Farouk himself, or the communists, or even the Muslim Brotherhood. Whatever the case may be, the army was called in, Prime Minister Nahas was dismissed, and a series of prime ministers failed to rule for any real length of time, or stop the chaos. This is when the CIA really stepped into the picture. Agents like Miles Copeland and Kermit Roosevelt had already met with the young officers. Then in February 1952, Allen Dulles, the CIA director, approved his support for a coup. However, we still don't know exactly what the support was. The CIA's attitude, in short, was that they wanted a strong secular military leadership in order to stop the potential of a communist uprising or a Muslim Brotherhood takeover. Yet, over in America, there was an influential Egyptian named Said Qutb. He was horrified at the liberalism that he saw, and wrote a book criticizing materialism, mixing of genders, and even jazz music, which, he said, the Negroes invented to satisfy their primitive inclinations, to excite bestial tendencies. Well, he would return to Egypt and join the Brotherhood, and his works would inspire many radical Islamists for years to come, including bin Laden and the Ayatollah in Iran. Meanwhile, Nasser received news that the king had been made aware of their names, and fearing arrest, he just decided to act in July. His troops blocked the roads leading to Cairo, and he gained the support of nearby units. The next morning, Anwar Sadat announced the formation of a new government, while the king abdicated in favour of his young son. The Revolutionary Command Council therefore took over the running of the country, and this included Naguib and old civilian leaders like Ali Meher. Together they set out their plan to eliminate feudalism, monopolies and imperialism, and of course strengthen their army. However, the civilian rulers like Meher refused to follow the army in appointing their nominees to cabinet. So he resigned and Naguib took over, becoming, as many said, the first Egyptian to rule Egypt in 2,000 years, after centuries of rule by Albanians, Turks, Arabs, Romans, Greeks and Persians. Naguib then began to remove opponents from power, as he, like many of the officers, argued, imperialism was not a result of war, but of local Egyptian traitors. Even former prime ministers like Ibrahim Abdel Hadi were hanged for corruption and treason. The monarchy was then finally abolished, political parties were banned, and any demonstrations were quickly put down. For instance, they lost the support of leftists, and strikes turned violent in Kafia al-Dawar. But Naguib just moved in and hanged their leaders. His troops would also begin to clash with the Muslim Brotherhood on the streets. But it was during this chaos that he began to fall out with Nasser, who favoured continuing military rule, while Naguib wanted to go back to the old civilian government. As Time magazine reported in April 1954, Naguib told the people of the return of civilian governments. But the people refused to enjoy it. They set up a new chant, "We want the revolution." The tide had set against him. Officers began a sit-down strike in barracks, police held a meeting and vowed that they would not police Naguib's election. Faced with so much opposition, Naguib caved in and allowed Nasser to take control. Nasser quickly cultivated a cult of personality by censoring the press and having songs made of his achievements. He also quickly turned on the Muslim Brotherhood after they tried to assassinate him, and thousands more were arrested, including Sayyid Qutb and Naguib himself. Internationally, he scored a major victory with the signing of a new treaty with the British, who agreed to a phased evacuation of their troops. But as part of the treaty, the Suez Canal Company would still hold on to the canal until 1968. Plus, in return for this agreement, Egypt were forced to give up their claims to Sudan, who had recently achieved their independence. In the broader picture though, this coup presented a new idea to the Islamic world known as Nasserism. It's quite hard to pin down concrete policies, but it's often described as pan-Arab socialism, so very similar to Baathism, which was growing in Syria. There, however, Shishkali ruled as a dictator after having taken power in a coup, and he was completely opposed to Nasserism, Baathism, or any unity with the Hashemite monarchs of Iraq and Jordan. Instead, he favoured a greater Syria, but this idea left him isolated internationally and paranoid domestically. He began to target the Druze, thinking that they were trying to assert their independence. Like in 1954, he bombed their positions and forced local leaders like Sultan al-Atrash, the leader of the Great Syrian Revolt, into exile. He also arrested many Nasserite officers like Adnan al-Malki, or those who had joined in the growing Baathist party. He therefore had no real support in the country. So the remaining Baathists, communists, Atassi supporters and Druze launched an insurrection around Homs. As his forces mutinied, he agreed to step down, and Atassi was brought into power once again. By this point though, Atassi was in his 80s, and he also rejected the ideas of Nasser, and clashed with his own Prime Minister Sabri al-Assali over this. In this climate, Atassi decided to move even closer to the Hashemite nations. Syria though was then shocked by the assassination of Adnan al-Malki in 1955, and this event highlighted the huge ideological differences in the nation. The SSNP were accused of carrying out the attack, and Prime Minister al-Assali cracked down on them afterwards. But their idea of a greater Syria was supported by former prime ministers like Fayez al-Khoury. Al-Assali, on the other hand, was a Nasserite and favoured a union with Egypt. But he wouldn't serve much longer, as his cabinet fell when the Baathists withdrew. Atassi appointed more moderate prime ministers, continuing to seek better relations with the Hashemites until his final resignation. With the presidency now opened up, a former leader, Quwatli, returned to the country. He completely refused to support an alliance with the Hashemites and had the support of Egypt and Saudi Arabia. He also moved firmly away from the West and asked the Soviet Union for weapons. However, in some cases, the left-wing elements in Syria would bring down his prime ministers. Like Said al-Ghazi lifted the sale of wheat to the west, but protests forced him out of power. Sabri al-Assali was brought back in as prime minister, firmly putting Syria on Nasser's side in the growing Arab Cold War. Factionalism therefore divided the nation, and other nations would suffer from a similar issue as Egyptian teachers were sent across the region and propaganda filled their airwaves, all promoting Nasserism. Like in Libya, which had been left in limbo after the Italians were chased out. The great powers were debating on dividing it up through the Bevin Sforza plan, which would give trusteeships to the Italians, French and British. However, most of the world disagreed with this plan. So, in 1949, the British agreed to just leave Cyrenaica and hand it over to Idris, the leader of the Senussis. The French tried to create their own provisional government in Fezzan, but the UN adopted a resolution saying that the country should be united and free by 1952. Even the Tripolitanians, who had long developed their own unique identity, went along with this. So the country was given their independence, with Idris as their king, and Mahmoud al-Muntasir as their prime minister. He faced Bashir Bey Sadawi in the next elections, but after violence broke out, Muntasir banned all opposition parties and exiled his opponents. Muntasir and Idris though were very pro-Western, and even allowed the British and Americans to build further bases in Libya in exchange for economic aid. This aid though was essential in building universities, developing their agriculture and the likes. By the end of the decade though, Esso prospectors struck oil, and the government was able to secure 50% of the profits. Idris, however, was more concerned with running Cyrenaica, and almost feudal disagreements began to emerge. He was therefore not involved in much of the pan-Arab movement, and ignored the Nasserite propaganda in Libyan schools. As one US report indicates, pupils do crayon drawings of Egyptian troops winning victories over Israel or Britain. In Benghazi, Libya, a complete course in Egyptian history is given to secondary school students. Obviously, this is fanning the flames of the future Gaddafi-led revolution. Otherwise, across the Mediterranean, Turkey of course was largely unaffected by all of this and continued to push for American protection against the Soviets, who were claiming bases in the Straits and land in the east. There had though been a change in leadership. Inonu, who had ruled the country since 1938, had initially been popular, as his status policies had redistributed land and provided many people with an education, but now the economy had stagnated. This allowed Jalal Bayar and his Democratic Party to win 85% of the seats. He pulled the country towards a more liberal economy in the west, and even sent around 15,000 men to fight in Korea. These troops earned praise from Douglas MacArthur, who said, "The heroism shown by the Turks has given hope to the American nation." However, there are conflicting reports of their usefulness in battle. Like Clay Blair said, the reality was that they were ill-trained, ill-led, and green to combat. Regardless, this helped them successfully join NATO, and America was free to build an airbase near Adana, where they continue to store nuclear weapons. However, although they joined NATO alongside Greece, there would be further violence between the two nations, as tensions were growing worse in British Cyprus. This island is of course inhabited by Greeks and Turks, and the problems emerged when the Greeks appealed to the UN for a British withdrawal from the island. The British then actually encouraged the Turks to make the same appeal on behalf of Turkish Cypriots, thereby creating a form of deadlock. Meanwhile, in Turkey, there were people who just claimed the island as outright Turkish. Prime Minister Adnan Menderes, for instance, said that the island was an extension of Anatolia, but only 20% of the population were actually Turkish. The Hurriyet paper also declared, "If the Greeks dare touch our brethren, then there are plenty of Greeks in Istanbul to retaliate upon." The situation then spiraled very quickly, as politicians claimed that there was a planned massacre of Turkish Cypriots. However, to set the scene of what would come next, I should say that Turkey's economy had decreased by 11%, and Istanbul was filling with shanty towns as the population there increased. The Greeks in the city, though, largely dominated much of the business, and were an easy scapegoat. Then, in 1955, the Turkish consulate in Thessaloniki was bombed, and this triggered pogroms in Istanbul. Yet this bombing was actually done by the Turks themselves, and later Turkish governments will actually execute Prime Minister Menderes for his role in all of this. Regardless, Turkish mobs from outside of Istanbul were brought in, and for 9 hours they attacked the Greek areas. Hundreds of women and children were assaulted, over a dozen were killed, and huge sections of the city were destroyed. All of which, even Erdogan said, was a result of a fascist policy. Human rights lawyer Alfred de Zayas said, "It can be described as a crime against humanity, comparable to the Nazis' Kristallnacht. Although few died, many did flee, shrinking the Greek population from 80,000 or so to 48,000 in 1965, when even those that remained were expelled. Tensions would of course continue to grow worse in Cyprus. But, going back to the Americans though, the CIA's success, or at least perceived success in Egypt, may well have encouraged them to take action in Iran, where a new crisis had begun. This all began when Mohammad Mossadegh led the National Front in protests against ballot rigging. A CIA report said it was more of a case of selection rather than election. The voter is the least important person in the process. Although prime ministers may have changed a lot, most were just the Shah's hand-picked men. They then go on to list a series of causes behind this, like 90% of the population is illiterate, the majority of people live in villages or tribal areas. For a while the Shah just ignored Mossadegh, but as the situation was becoming more and more volatile, a new Islamist group was formed, known as Fadayan-e-Islam. It was founded by Nawab Safavi, who led his members on attacks on anyone they deemed to be enemies of Islam. For instance, Ahmad Khosravi, a prominent secularist, was stabbed in court. Abdul Hussein Hazia, the former prime minister, was killed, and even the Shah himself became a target. The Shah actually blamed the large communist Tudeh party for this and cracked down on them, but the Islamists then assassinated the prime minister, Haj Ali Razmara, in 1951. Many condemned this action, including Abdul Qasim Kasani, a Shia cleric. He was also the leader of the Society of Muslim Warriors, who were in union with Mossadegh in this large national front. Together they were mainly focused on ending vote rigging and nationalising Iranian oil, but once again, this was a strange alliance of socialists, anti-communists and Islamists. Well, it was in this environment that the Shah finally relented and allowed Mossadegh to come to power in elections. He quickly tried to renegotiate the treaties and just split the profits of oil 50-50, just like the Venezuelans had done. The Americans meanwhile supported Britain in public, but disagreed with their colonial policies, much like they had done with the French in Algeria. So they tried to step in to find a compromise, but the British refused. The British deemed this as theft, as in their eyes they had discovered the oil and built the infrastructure to extract it, all while sharing some of the profits. Plus they argued to the Americans that it would be a victory for the Soviets. So Mossadegh just went ahead and nationalised the entire oil industry, and Britain responded by placing sanctions on Iran and blockading their ports. All the foreign technicians were also pulled out of the country, leaving Iran unable to keep their oil wells in operation. They tried to hire some foreigners to help, but most nations stood by Britain, including the likes of Pakistan. Only the Italians actually agreed to send over some advisors, but the Royal Navy intercepted them on their way. Also, inside Iran, the National Front had many issues. The Islamist forces carried out violent attacks on their opponents, and Kashani demanded a move away from secularism. The Shah also didn't get along with Mossadegh, but the nationalisation of oil made Mossadegh too popular for the Shah to act against. By 1953, Mossadegh had managed to drive Kashani from power and turned to the communist Tudeh party for support. Their mobs began to attack the Islamists and expand their power, but their violence undermined Mossadegh, and his supporters were in turn attacked by Islamists and pro-Shah factions. Plus, because the Tudeh party supported the Soviets, this helped convince the Americans of joining the British and interfering. Dwight D. Eisenhower had become the new president, and he was far more concerned with the Middle East. British agents meanwhile had been bribing regional leaders and parliamentarians, while their blockade had left the country facing bankruptcy. Faced with the loss of popular support and even a loss of power in parliament, Mossadegh delayed elections and jailed many opponents. He then held a referendum to completely dissolve parliament and allow his government to rule. This was passed with an overwhelming majority of over 99.9%, which the American press described as more fantastic and farcical than any ever held under Hitler or Stalin, and this was a clear attempt to make himself dictator. This was the final straw for the Shah, who finally looked to restore his old powers. The first attempt to oust Mossadegh was simple. The Shah would issue a royal decree to depose him, and he appointed General Fazlollah Zahedi as the new prime minister. However, the colonel that delivered the decree to Mossadegh was just arrested, and the Shah fled to Baghdad. The first coup was therefore a complete disaster, but there was another plan, revolving around Ayatollah Mohammad Bababani. He was allegedly given a lot of money by the CIA and stirred up Islamist opposition to Mossadegh. In the midst of this, Tudor members took to the streets again and attacked symbols of the monarchy, even worrying Mossadegh, who sent in troops to break up the crowds. The new far-right group, known as Sumka, then joined in the fighting against the communists and alongside many Islamists. Many have accused this group of being funded by the CIA, although they were never really large in numbers. What happened next, though, had never really been established. But it seems as part of Operation Ajax, the British and American agents had been able to set up a base in Qashqai lands and distribute funds to allies. Some were hired to pose as communist Tudor members to start attacks, and then this encouraged anti-communists to join in to support the Shah. In one case, they even bombed a Muslim leader's house while posing as communists. However, some who were accused of working with the Americans, like the pro-Shah local strongman Shaban the Brainless, has denied all these claims. Plus, although this is often seen to be a CIA-led coup, many Muslim scholars like Amir Tahiri say that the CIA's initial coup plan had completely failed, and the successful one was led by average Iranian citizens. In fact, the CIA even wrote to Eisenhower after the first failed coup that they probably have to snuggle up to Mossadegh if we're going to save our influence in Iran. Also, American motives have been contended. The threat of communism may have been overstated, as they were seemingly exaggerating the threat themselves. But on the other hand, communists were achieving victories around the world, in China, Eastern Europe and more. It may also have been a fear of the nationalization of oil setting a precedent in the Islamic world. The British, of course, were interested in oil, but there's nothing to indicate that the Americans had much reason to produce oil in such a volatile nation, especially as it would worsen their relations with other allies in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And again, Mossadegh did have many enemies regardless. For instance, Mozaffar Bourkai had long stood by him, but he pulled his Toilers Party out of the National Front and met with Zahedi. They conspired to dismantle Mossadegh's security forces, and to do this, they captured the chief of police and tortured him. The Shah's supporters then began storming government buildings, and again, some of these may be funded by the CIA, but Mossadegh by now had alienated Islamists, royalists, communists and more. Like Kashani and the Ayatollah, mobilized a couple thousand men each. In the midst of the chaos, a tank fired a shell into Mossadegh's house and he surrendered to Zahedi. The CIA flew the Shah back from exile to Iran, where he assumed office, and Zahedi became the new prime minister. Thousands of other political opponents were arrested, communists were purged from the army, and Mossadegh's allies were killed. To further secure his rule, the Shah formed a secret police force known as Savak. Most of their officers, by the way, were trained by a CIA officer, Norman Schwarzkopf. The Shah also allowed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to return, but they now had to share with a consortium of other oil companies, including Royal Dutch Shell and a few American companies. Together, they greatly increased oil revenues coming into Iran from $34 million to $181 million in just a couple of years. This, along with aid packages, allowed Iran to develop rapidly. After all of this, the Middle East was dividing into rival camps. Broadly speaking, on one side was the pro-Western royals, alongside Turkey and possibly Lebanon. On the other were the Republicans, headed by Nasser, which aimed at spreading their influence. And you could possibly put anti-Western Yemen in this camp as well, while Saudi Arabia remained somewhat divided at this time. But even many of the Muslim leaders were ignoring events in French North Africa. In Tunisia, the independence movement began once again picking up steam, often because of the controversial tactics of the French. For instance, they funded terrorist groups like the Red Hand that targeted high-profile leaders. Like in 1952, they killed the trade unionist Farhat Hashid. This started a huge wave of protests over in Morocco, and there the French tactics were even more controversial. The Moroccan nationalist movement had been championed by the Sultan Mohammed V, and the French were trying to put an end to this. For instance, back in 1947 he gave a speech in Tangier, which had actually been made an international zone in the 1920s. The French, though, tried to stop him making this speech by having Senegalese troops massacre people in Casablanca, forcing the Sultan to return home. They killed around 200 people, but the Sultan still went ahead to Tangier, and there he gave a speech laying out his vision for unified Morocco. But sticking in Tunisia, their major nationalist leader was Bourguiba. He had actually been in exile in Egypt, and there he met Abd el-Krim, the former leader of the Rif Republic. Together they began to push for support of their cause in the Arab League, as North Africa was largely ignored by the organisation. Bourguiba, however, disagreed with el-Krim's calls for armed insurrection and just returned home. He took back control of his Neo-Destor party and began dialogue with the French. Even in 1950, he was welcoming of the idea of just achieving autonomy. As he said, "We believe that we are a country too weak militarily and too strong strategically to dispense with the help of a great power, which we want to be France." This angered many nationalists, but Bourguiba did have the support of Lamine Bey. Together they pushed the French to make reforms, like allowing some Tunisians to sit in on parliament. Bourguiba then travelled around the world trying to whip up support for his cause in countries like India, Indonesia and more. But even the Egyptians and Saudis didn't make any promises to even raise the issue in the UN. However, his cause was then shook by the French foreign minister and architect of the EU, Robert Schuman. He said that France demands that the French community in Tunisia have a share in all the institutions of the country. In other words, they were not going to make reforms. In response to this, Bourguiba said, "Exasperated, disappointed, out of patience, the Tunisian people will show the entire world that they are mature enough for freedom." He held a congress in Tunis and armed resistance began, finally gaining some support from outside powers. But the French responded swiftly and arrested him. The Tunisians, though, were then granted a real lifeline when Pierre Mendès France became Prime Minister. Although he only held the post for 8 months, he had promised to finally end the war in Indochina, which most people had no desire to continue. Continuing on with this decolonization, he then met with Bourguiba and promised some form of autonomy to the Tunisians. However, this was soon an unpopular decision, as the Algerian War soon erupted, and French papers began to accuse the Tunisians of stirring up trouble. To understand this, though, we first need to look at Algeria. Here they had many nationalists pushing for independence, but no one leader was uniting them. Like Ferhat Abbas had led the Democratic Union of the Algerian Manifesto, and as the French saw Algeria as part of France itself and not just a colony, he was able to gain seats in the Assembly in Paris. There was also the Movement for the Triumph of Democratic Liberties, or MTLD, headed by Messali Hadj. These two groups had a pretty similar cause though, demanding full independence, or at the very least autonomy. But then there were also communist groups that had thousands of members and a growing number of paramilitaries. These paramilitaries began to grow especially after the French massacred Algerians in Sétif in 1945. For instance, there was the Special Organization, which was a sort of wing of the MTLD. So, on the one hand, they entered the French Assembly, while also recruiting guerrilla fighters in Algeria. Some of these fighters, like Ahmed Ben Bella, would rob post offices to raise funds, but he was forced to flee to Nasser's Egypt. He was joined by Ferhat Abbas soon enough, who, despite believing in democratic means, was arrested a couple times and just chose to flee the country. By 1954, many of the more revolutionary members of the MTLD were growing impatient with Hadj, and decided to form yet another group, which would eventually become the FLN. This would include the likes of Mohamed Boudiaf, Labi Ben Mhidi, and Mustafa Ben Boulaid. In the declaration of November the 1st, they announced the beginning of armed insurrection, and that night, 70 targets were attacked on what has been called Red All Saints' Day. Here, though, Pierre Mendès France was not an anti-colonialist, and he, like many, saw this as France. He declared the Algerian departments are part of the French Republic. They have been French for a long time, and they are irrevocably French. François Mitterrand would also say, "I will not agree to negotiate with the enemies of the homeland. The only negotiation is war." It has been said that the revolutionaries only had 500 men at the beginning of the war, but French reinforcements and tactics seem to have pushed even more people to join the cause. Yet still, initially the nationalists were split. Messali Hadj, for instance, formed his own military wing, known as the MNA. This group was quickly destroyed by the FLN in Algeria, but the fighting continued over in France itself. There, the MNA actually had quite a sizable following among the immigrants, and they engaged in the Café Wars against the FLN. During these wars, both sides would bomb cafes frequented by the opposition, and around 5,000 people were killed in total. Back in Algeria, the French Governor-General, Jacques Soustelle, saw that violence would not end the conflict. Instead, he planned on investing huge sums of money into Algeria, in order to improve the lives of the people and therefore end the rebellion. He sent out agents to buy land, which would then be redistributed to the many Muslim peasants. And fortunately for him, many of the French settlers, or Pieds Noirs, were selling their land quickly in order to escape the violence in the countryside. Other reforms included opening up hundreds of schools and training up Muslims to serve in the civil service, as only 1/3 of the civil service jobs were held by Muslims. Yet none of this was ever put into practice, as in the summer of '55, the FLN advanced on Philippeville. On their way, they killed any European they found, like in the mining town of El Halia. There they waited until the European men were working in the mines, and then they assaulted and killed mainly the women and children of the town, in some cases even disemboweling them. This of course caused outrage across Algeria and France. The French soldiers that discovered the scene later that day began to carry out reprisal attacks. Straight away, 80 men were shot without a trial in El Halia, then 60 more at El Kroub. Villages suspected of harbouring FLN members were also razed. One French soldier reported, "For 2 hours all we heard was automatic rifles spitting into the crowd, and there were so many that they had to be buried with bulldozers." The Pieds Noirs formed their own militias to join the French army in these attacks, and now suspected any Muslim as a potential enemy and lynched anyone that they deemed to be suspicious. Yet the commander of the FLN assault, Youssef Zaghloud, had largely managed to achieve his initial goal in ending peace talks and forcing the population to pick a side. Even Soustelle believed that peace was never an option after this attack. While all this was going on in Tunisia, Bourguiba was still in talks with the French, but this angered many, like Salah ben Youssef, who believed it was a complete betrayal. Bourguiba, though, had managed to secure some internal autonomy and the creation of a new cabinet which included no Frenchmen. In exchange for this, he agreed to work with the French in disarming the rebels in the country. He handed that job over to Tahar Ben Ammar, while he handpicked the ministers. Instead, he travelled around the country to build up support, but in late '55, Ben Youssef returned and built up his own force to challenge Bourguiba. Violence between the two groups began to break out, but Bourguiba had the support of the army, which included many French officers, and they chased Ben Youssef into exile. The French by this point were fearful of having to police another civil war, so they finally agreed to grant Tunisia their independence. Crucially though, French troops could remain in the country for a while to combat the FLN. 1956 was also the year that the Moroccans achieved their independence. While it seemed inevitable for a while, the Americans continued to work within the country trying to pull the people to their side in the Cold War. In most cases, this was just by using soft power. Strangely though, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi began to work with different political parties. Like in 1953, Pepsi helped fund the publication of pamphlets for the Istiqlal Party, while Coca-Cola donated drinks to a function for the Reformers Party. However, the French still looked to remove the Sultan from power, and here they found an ally in Tamim al-Glaoui. He had taken part in rebellions decades earlier and secured himself the position dubbed Lord of the Atlas. Remember, at this time, Morocco was still pretty feudal. In his old age, he dined with Western leaders, built golf courses, and accumulated a vast fortune. Now though, he feared that the Istiqlal Party could challenge his tribal power. So, after some arguments over royal protocol and the likes, the Sultan sent Tamim away from the capital, and he went on to join the French. Together they united their forces, and in 1953 they found their opportunity to strike. In fact, it was around this time that there had been riots and protests to the killing of the trade unionist Farhat Hashid. In the aftermath of this, many Istiqlal Party members were arrested, and then, in the chaos, the French moved in, forced the Sultan into exile in 1953, and essentially just took power in a coup. They brought in Mohammed Ben Arafa, the Sultan's cousin, to serve as their new puppet ruler, but nobody accepted him, and revolts broke out across the country. Mohammed Zarqtouni bombed Casablanca's central market, and in Oujda they killed a number of Europeans. Ben Arafa himself was nearly assassinated, the Berbers attacked Europeans in towns like Oudzem, and a new liberation army was founded, led by Ebis Masadi. Also, strangely, the Moroccan population, in large numbers, began to hear stories of the deposed Sultan's miracles. In one case, thousands claimed to have seen his face on the moon. Seeing the whole situation spiral out of control, Tamim and the French brought back Mohammed V. The French and Spanish together then united for an end of their protectorates, and Morocco became independent in 1956. However, Spain kept hold of a couple colonies, where Abbas Masadi had found the Army of Moroccan Liberation. In just a couple of years, yet another Rif War would break out in the north, while the Ifni War broke out in the south. The Sultan meanwhile now had to contend with the Istiqlal Party for power in his new state, as their union quickly began to crumble. However, moving away from North Africa, as over in Arabia, the Saudis nearly went to war over Buraimi, a region which had long been fought over. This all started when the Arabian Oil Company began to explore the area, and they encouraged Ibn Saud to expand his claims over it, and in 1952, Saudi troops moved in. It should be said though that Said bin Taimur was still ruling Oman and was growing rich thanks to the discovery of oil. Also in 1951, he managed to negotiate for recognition of his full independence, albeit still under British influence. Also important to this story, Shakbut bin Sultan Al Nahyan was still ruling in Abu Dhabi, which in turn was part of the Trukel states. There had been some changes in leadership in the region, like Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa ruled in Bahrain, yet he continued the country down much the same path. The only major change in direction came in Kuwait, where Abdullah al-Salim al-Sabah took over in 1950. He was not as pro-British as his predecessors, and will later declare full independence. Back to Buraimi though. To counter the Saudis, the Imam of Oman and the Sultan of Muscat, historic rivals, actually united to put together an army. The British also brought in troops and signed a standstill agreement, hoping to negotiate a peace. In the meantime though, Ibn Saud died in 1953 and was replaced by Saud bin Abdulaziz al Saud. More commonly, he's just referred to as Saud. He actually got to work, using oil money, on a war on poverty, ignorance and disease, and moved many government buildings from Jeddah to Riyadh. Internationally, he went on a tour of Islamic countries, hoping to unify Muslims all over the world. As such, he started to support the FLN and the likes financially. Well, around Buraimi, he continued to bribe local leaders and royals to join his side, forcing the British to finally move in and chase them out in late 1955. But the Saudis still claimed the territory for decades. In short, by this point, North Africa was now largely free, Nasser had taken over Egypt, the Saudis were under new leadership, and throughout it all, the Western powers were worried about the Soviets encroaching south. The British therefore led the way in forming a new bloc of allied nations to counter the threat, which would be supported financially by the Americans. The new bloc was called the Central Treaty Organization, or CENTO, or the Baghdad Pact. This would almost be like a Middle Eastern NATO. Initially, the Americans had been trying to get Nasser to lead such a bloc. To gain his favour, the Americans even applied pressure on Britain to agree to withdraw from the Suez Canal. However, Nasser still knew that such an alliance would be unpopular, and he disagreed with Eisenhower's even-handedness over the Arab-Israeli conflict. So the Western powers turned to the north and brought in countries like Iran and Turkey, who both feared the Soviet Union, alongside Pakistan, who had been forming close ties with Turkey. Also, as the name of the pact suggests, there was Iraq. Here Nouri still ruled alongside now adult King Faisal II. They were enjoying the benefits of British oil exploitation, so much so that Faisal actually planned on turning Baghdad into a huge utopian city. Being so close to the West could also help in combating the growing communist threat, and even the new threat of Nasserism. Much like in Libya, Egyptian influence was growing in Iraq, and many went on strike in 1952, demanding the abolition of their monarchy as well. However, martial law was declared, and Iraq joined the Baghdad Pact. Although in the long run it didn't accomplish a great deal, initially it caused panic in Egypt, as Nasser saw this as a British attempt to expand Iraqi influence. He, however, had more pressing issues at home, as he more or less allowed Israel to raid his country. This started because of the Palestinian insurgency, which began almost immediately after the war. Thousands of Palestinians had returned home to continue the fight, while many refugees in Egypt launched cross-border raids into Israel. In response, Ariel Sharon and his new force, Unit 101, launched reprisal attacks. Like in the El Buraij refugee camp, they killed 30 people. As Moshe Dayan said, "We are not able to protect every man, but we can prove that the price for Jewish blood is high." The Egyptians still owned Gaza at this point, and were funding Palestinian groups. Nasser himself gave a speech saying, "Egypt has decided to dispatch her heroes, the disciples of Pharaoh and the sons of Islam, and they will cleanse the land of Palestine." However, Israeli troops moved into Gaza, conducted house-to-house searches, and again killed many. In some operations like Black Arrow and El Khayyam, they even managed to destroy Egyptian bases and kill over 100 soldiers. And Nasser did very little to stop this. Israel at the same time was also suffering, as their ships were not allowed to use the Suez Canal, and they had only just built the small port of Eilat on the Straits of Tiran. However, here they could only ship in non-strategic goods. Essentially, they were under blockade, and their economy suffered. Although it is often said that America has propped up the state of Israel, in these early years it wasn't always the case. The Americans in fact signed a tripartite agreement with the British and French in order to prevent border changes, and they refused to sell weapons to Israel in order to stop an arms race. In fact, Israel at this point still depended heavily on German war reparations, and in terms of arms, they first got them from Czechoslovakia, and these days they were buying them from the French, who of course were ignoring the treaty that they had just signed. Nasser meanwhile was also continuing to rearm. He saw that the Baghdad Pact and the Gaza raids were undermining his position in the Arab League. To buy weapons, he approached the Western allies first, but as he said, France bargained with us, saying that she would only supply us with arms if we refrained from criticizing her attitude in North Africa, which was another way of saying that we should abandon our Arabism, while the French and British refused to do so as they continued to fear an arms race. Strangely though, it was the Soviets and the Czechs that had largely helped form Israel thanks to their shipment of weapons early on, and now they had completely reversed course. The reasons for this can be debated, but there are a couple of causes. The formation of Israel seems to have created a sense of nationalism among Jews in the Soviet Union, something that Stalin despised. And around 1949, he began to refer to them as rootless cosmopolitans, who were potential foreign agents. While in Israel the Soviets saw the communists were declining power, and the anti-British Zionism of years past had largely ended as well. So the Soviets accused the new state of being a tool of the West. Also, their new leader Khrushchev completely changed Soviet foreign policy. Under Stalin, only communist nations could be seen as allies, but Khrushchev saw the possibility of bringing in non-aligned nations under their sphere. Zhou Enlai of China, in fact, was key in recommending Nasser as a potential communist ally. So, through communist Czechoslovakia, arms were shipped to Egypt. This, however, is even more strange because Nasser had employed a number of former Nazis in his forces. So, Soviet weapons were in the hands of former Nazi officers. British troops, as I mentioned before, had already agreed to leave the Canal Zone. After all, they could no longer argue it was essential to defend India, as they had now been given their independence. Yet they, like all of Europe, depended on the canal for oil shipments. So, as I mentioned before, as per the agreement of 1954, the Suez Canal Company would still control the canal until the late 60s. But many in Europe saw the arrival of Soviet weapons as a threat. The French also saw Nasser as tied to the FLN in Algeria. As Guy Mollet said, just as Hitler's policy was written down in Mein Kampf, Nasser has the ambition to recreate the conquests of Islam. But his present position is largely due to the policy of the West in building up and flattering him. In short, he saw Nasser as a new fascist, and the West were appeasing him. Otherwise, Egyptian propaganda continued to fill the airways of the Arab world, and they encouraged protests in Jordan in 1955 and 56. They succeeded in forcing Hussein to remove Glubb Pasha, the British officer, from his posts. And they also demanded and succeeded in keeping Jordan out of the Baghdad Pact. This turned Anthony Eden of Britain completely against Nasser, seeing his policies as a disruptive force in the region. However, in the following meetings between the USA and Nasser, they tried to negotiate a peace with Israel, but Nasser demanded the full annexation of southern Israel and an incredible amount of US aid. He also angered the Americans once again by recognizing the People's Republic of China, causing the US to pull funding for the Aswan Dam, which they and the British had only just agreed to fund. Eisenhower summed up his views though by saying, if Egypt finds herself thus isolated from the rest of the Arab world, and with no ally in sight except Soviet Russia, she would very quickly get sick of the prospect and would join us in search for a just and decent peace in the region. He therefore believed that Nasser was just playing the major powers against one another in order to get money. But Nasser decided to do something completely different. With the funding gone, he nationalised the Suez Canal, froze all the assets of the Suez Canal Company, and agreed to buy them out for a fair price. He also closed off the Straits of Tiran to the Israelis in violation of international law. This whole thing seemingly came out of the blue, even to the Egyptian ministers, so it seems to have been a quick decision made by Nasser alone. Anthony Eden was actually at dinner with Faisal II and Nouri of Iraq, and they both allegedly recommended, hit Nasser hard, hit him soon, and hit him by yourself. The leader of the opposition in Parliament, Hugh Gaitskell, even said, "It is exactly the same thing we encountered from Mussolini and Hitler in those early years before the war." And the diplomat Ivan Kirkpatrick said Nasser was resolved to wreck us. "If Middle Eastern oil is denied to us for a year or two, our gold reserves will disappear. If our gold reserves disappear, the sterling area disintegrates." They joined with the French under Guy Mollet, who, as I mentioned before, drew comparisons between Nasser and Hitler, and called a meeting of many nations. They got the support from some, including Pakistan, and together they sent a committee to Egypt. The committee unsuccessfully tried to demand an international body to govern over the canal, while the British, French and Israelis began making other plans. Eden ordered the army to plan for a paratrooper invasion from Cyprus, or a naval blockade of Port Said. In Israel, Moshe Dayan believed that they should attack first, with French aid, and together they worked on a separate plan. Britain, however, was hesitant of allowing the Israelis to invade, as it would worsen relations with their Arab allies. The French and the Israelis went on planning regardless, without British involvement, until October 1956, at Sèvres, they told the British about their plans. At the talks, Ben-Gurion even highlighted a possible reorganization of the Middle East. According to David Tal, Ben-Gurion planned on taking Sinai, while Jordan, he observed, was not viable as an independent state and should therefore be divided. Iraq would get the East Bank in return for a promise to settle Palestinian refugees. Also, they would move up to the Litani River, thereby helping to turn Lebanon into a more compact Christian state. The Israelis, though, actually had more reasons to worry about Jordan and Syria at this time. This is because Suleiman Nabulsi was elected the Prime Minister of Jordan, and he wanted to pull the country away from the west and closer to Nasser. However, he and King Hussein were in a very strange position. They saw the tides turning against Britain, and therefore turned more towards Arab unity. But, in early 1956, the Saudis were amassing troops on their southern borders, while the Egyptian Foreign Minister, Fawzi, declared globalist Jordan was now a primary Egyptian objective. The Egyptians and Saudis were at this point almost natural allies against the Hashemite royals in Jordan and Iraq, and now Jordan was essentially defenseless. The new head of the Jordanian army was Ali Abu Nuwar, a keen supporter of Nasser and a supporter of Pan-Arabism. It seems that under his leadership, the Jordanians started funding their own raids into Israel. The Israelis therefore feared that they would be invaded by Egypt and their nation would be surrounded. But the Jordanians were also worried that they too were going to be invaded. The British tried to stop the spread of Egyptian influence by sending Iraqi planes to Jordan, something the Israelis objected to as they had never made peace with Iraq. Moshe Dayan even said of Britain, "At the very moment when they are preparing to topple Nasser, who is a common enemy of theirs and Israel's, they insist on getting the Iraqi army into Jordan, even if such action leads to a war between Israel and Jordan, in which they, the British, will take part against Israel." In fact, Peter Westlake reminded the Israelis that the British would defend Jordan after the Israelis raided a Jordanian base in the West Bank. So, to recap, Israel, France and Britain were planning on fighting Egypt. Egypt and much of the Jordanian government were united. Yet, Egypt and Saudi Arabia were making moves to take over Jordan. Also, Britain and Iraq were supporting Jordan, even if this meant going to war with Israel. Then, after Nabulsi won the first real election in Jordan, he quickly signed an alliance with Egypt and Syria, on paper at least, unifying their armed forces. To make matters even more complicated though, the Israelis reported that Soviet troops were arriving in Syria. As Dayan reported, there are German volunteers in Egypt, and now it seems that already a group of volunteers from behind the Iron Curtain have arrived. They are described as being Muslims living in the Eastern Bloc. Most Syrian soldiers were also trained in communist nations, and the Soviets shipped weapons here as well. Ben-Gurion even said of Egyptian submarines, "We assume that the crews are Soviets." This could have gone even further, As Nasser said to the Soviets, Syria and Saudi Arabia have authorized me to turn to the Soviet Union. The three countries request, therefore, that Muslims from the Soviet republics in Central Asia assist them when necessary in using military technology. And there was even mention of Yemen as well. In Yemen, Ahmad bin Yahya continued to rule, albeit with some challenges. He was a cruel leader dubbed the Devil and continued to be opposed by Republicans and other royals alike. Like in 1955, there was a coup attempt led by a colonel, al-Tuleya. The plan was to put one of his brothers on the throne, and initially it appeared to work as they besieged the palace. But the Imam simply paid off many of the besiegers, leaving only a few dozen of them. What followed next, Time magazine reported. The Imam suddenly burst out of the palace gates, flourishing a long scimitar. Before the sentries could get over their shock, he had slashed 2 of them dead. Exchanging the sword for a submachine gun, he led his 150 guards onto the roof of the palace and began a direct attack on the rebels. The old Imam leading the defeated colonel into the square in front of the palace and crying to the crowd, "Look at this man, I personally sent him to be educated in Iraq. I made him chief of the army, I trusted him, I even let him use my airplane. And now look how he has repaid me. I leave it to you. If you say forgive, I will let him go. If you say otherwise..." The mob howled for blood. Now secure on his throne, the Imam met with the Saudis to sign the Jeddah Pact around this time, which was all part of a clear attempt to create a bloc of nations to oppose the Baghdad Pact. Many of these nations were clearly pro-Soviet except the Saudis, who now had a more complicated foreign policy. While in Moscow, Khrushchev allegedly admitted, "At the moment we don't know how to help Egypt, but we are holding constant meetings to discuss the problem." So there was now some urgency, especially for Israel, and fortunately for them, Eden finally agreed to their plans. In short, Israel would invade Egypt, and then Britain and France would step in to stop the war, forcing both sides to withdraw a distance from the Suez Canal. This all began in late October as Israeli troops moved in, and mainly British and French pilots bombed Egyptian positions. Many Israeli troops did also remain along the Jordanian border, expecting a war on 2 fronts. Many of the border villages were placed under curfew, and the Israeli forces massacred Arab civilians at Kafr Qasim, who were returning from work unaware of the curfew. But even though Hussein and many Jordanians wanted to join, Nabulsi favoured restraint. As for Egypt, they lost battle after battle as the Israelis landed in Ras al-Nakib and grounded their air force. The Egyptian Navy was sent to bomb Haifa, but the Allies protected the Israeli coast and harassed them on their retreat. On land, on November the 1st, the Israelis took Gaza, where they have been accused of further massacres, known as the Khan Yunis killings, but this has been disputed. Sharm el-Sheikh fell shortly afterwards. Nasser redirected troops to the Suez and sank ships in the canal to block all traffic, obviously preparing for the invasion. On the 5th, this invasion came as the British and French troops landed, quickly captured land around Port Said, and suffered very few casualties. From here, they consolidated their position as the Egyptian commanders encouraged all citizens to resist, calling this the People's War. To stop it spiraling out of control, Eden and much of the British command tried to limit civilian casualties. But still, the planned bombing campaign was intended to terrorize the Egyptians, and hundreds of lives were lost. Plus, the public back home began to protest against the whole thing. Some in fact believed that it had been delayed too long and public support had shifted, especially as now the Soviets were crushing Hungarian protesters. As one journalist wrote, "The Prime Minister has told us that 50 million tons of British shipping are at stake in his dispute with President Nasser. What is at stake in Central Europe are rather more than 50 million souls." So defending those of Central Europe was more important than defending shipping in the canal. Otherwise, of course, across the Islamic world, people voiced their opposition to the events. King Saud embargoed oil shipments to Britain and France, the Syrians blew up oil lines, and much more. In America, Nixon said, "We couldn't on one hand complain about the Soviets intervening in Hungary, and on the other hand approve of the British and French picking that particular time to intervene against Nasser." America therefore began working against Britain. The British at this time were losing a lot of money due to the oil embargoes, and they applied to the IMF for a loan. But Eisenhower stepped in to block it. In desperation, Selwyn Lloyd, the Foreign Secretary, even said, "It was possible that oil sanctions might be imposed against us. We might be compelled to occupy Kuwait and Qatar." But this seemed like an empty threat. The Soviets also threatened to intervene on behalf of the Egyptians with nuclear strikes. These threats were taken very seriously by Eisenhower, who said of Russia, "They are as scared and furious as Hitler was in his last days. There's nothing more dangerous than a dictatorship in that frame of mind." While Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA that oversaw the coup in Iran, believed that Khrushchev was obviously intoxicated much of the time and could be expected to commit irrational acts. Also, in the United Nations, countries voted overwhelmingly for a ceasefire and the Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. But Ben-Gurion began to hint at possibly annexing the entire region. However, facing economic ruin, Eden announced a ceasefire on the 6th without informing the French and Israelis. The French and British then gradually withdrew by that September, while the Israelis maintained their position until March the following year, ending the whole Suez crisis.